Welcome back, everybody. Mike Menard, and I hope that you enjoyed Dana Joya's piece. I know I sure like it because I like his perspective because it makes maybe one of the best cases I've ever heard for why we read. But today we're going to talk about the monomyth, or I'm jokingly calling it one story to rule them all. Now, I don't know if you've ever had this feeling like I do when I go to see films anymore or read things, where I just feel like we're only telling one story. It seems like all the stories sound the same and they all seem to be the exact same story. And if you felt that way, well, then you're not the first, because lots of people have felt that way through history. And I think I'm going to even endorse the idea that such an idea exists. Um, I'm going to pop into my PowerPoint here, if I may, and we're going to talk about the monomyth. But one of the things, first of all, I want to mention is I love this passage from Psalm 50, where it says, "The mighty one, God, the Lord, speaks to us through all things on earth, from the rising of the sun to the place where it sets." I love that idea because I believe that God can speak, yes, through nature and of course through scripture, but he also speaks to us through our great stories. That could even sometimes include stories that surprise us a little bit. But I want you to ask yourself a question for a moment. If you need to, you can even pause and just write it down. What are your favorite stories in the world? For example, what movies do you love? And by movies do you love, what movies have you seen 50 times and you'll probably see them 50 times more? Not the films that you're supposed to like, the ones you really like. Maybe it's Star Wars. Maybe it's the Lord of the Rings series. Maybe it's Harry Potter. Maybe it's a romantic comedy of some sort. Uh, Whatever it is, write it down. Maybe just put it down because I think it'll be helpful for you to have it in front of you. So write it down. Maybe also think about, what books do you love? If you still are a reader of books, if you're one of the 10% of the population that reads 60% of the books, what books do you love? I don't often reread books. Once I've read a book, I don't often read it again, but there are some I love so much that I have read them again. So maybe write some of those down. Maybe it's something modern. Maybe it's something like, one of my all-time favorite books is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I love that book. I never tire of it. For some, it might be something a little more contemporary, like one of the Narnia books or the Narnia series. And then maybe also ask this question: do you have a favorite Bible story? The story that when they have charades, this is your go-to. Maybe it's David and Goliath. Maybe it's Ruth and Boaz and Naomi. Maybe it's Esther. Maybe it's Joseph. Maybe it's Moses. Maybe it's just the story of Jesus. Whatever it is, maybe it's Samson. Although that's not often people's favorite story because it ends so tragically. And then ask yourself this question: what do all of the stories that I love, that you love, have in common? Like, just if you wrote them down, which I hope you did, ask yourself, do you have a heavy dose of romances there? Do you like mysteries? Do you like adventures where they go out on a quest? Do you like the ones where good defeats evil? I love those stories, those big epic. That's why I love Lord of the Rings. That's why I love Tolkien. That's why I love C.S. Lewis. Maybe you would love those stories where the outsiders, the ones that everyone rejected, get accepted, or misunderstood characters are proven worthy in some way. What do they have in common? And then ask yourself maybe the hardest question: why? Why do you love these stories? What is it about these stories that draws me to them? It might be I have a very close friend whose favorite movie is Dirty Dancing. She's seen it, I'm sure, 100 times. Will probably see it 100 times more. Never gets tired of it. It's kind of a guilty pleasure. Why? What is it about that that continues to appeal to her? Now, don't laugh because I'm going to tell you my favorite movies. Some of these I may have to turn in my man card because well, just don't laugh. First of all, I love the film Amadeus. Uh, Beautiful, beautiful film. I believe came out in the 80s. Not a true story by any means, about the guy who supposedly killed Mozart. A wonderful film. I love the film Finding Neverland, which is about J.M. Barrie, the author of uh, Peter Pan. And because I love a lot of stories about creative people. I love Ben-Hur. I just love it, the big epic version. I've seen the new version and it's okay, but I especially love the Charlton Heston one. I mean, how can you beat that great chariot race that they have? I love The Sound of Music. I won't lie. I totally love The Sound of Music. I've seen it so many times. I once was in Puerto Rico, as we often were, because my wife's family is from Puerto Rico, and I didn't understand what anyone was saying, so I turned on the TV, and they were about to show The Sound of Music. And it started, and I was so excited, and Julie Andrews opened up her mouth and started singing in Spanish. And the entire film was dubbed, but I knew every word they were saying because I've seen it so many times. And then, of course, I love Pride and Prejudice. I love Jane Austen in general. And I should have also put Jane Eyre on here because I think that is my favorite book. But I love Pride and Prejudice. I love this film version, this BBC longer version. My favorite Bible stories, I love the story of Gideon. I think it's because I had two younger sisters, and we would play Gideon, and I'd be Gideon, and they'd be the Midianites, and I'd blow a trumpet, and they would all die. And I also loved Jericho for the same reason. I'd march around them and then scream really loud. They'd fall over dead. And then I love the burning bush for reasons I'm not exactly sure. Maybe I need to find out what's behind that. I really love that. We have our stories that we love. Now, one of the things that's super interesting that people began to understand very early on, uh, especially with the pioneering work of Carl Jung. Now, Carl Jung was a protege of Freud, and he eventually parted with Freud because he felt that Freud was a little obsessed with youthful sexuality. And Jung was more interested in mythology. He believed that myths somehow held the key to help us as human beings uh, grow and to heal. He felt that the myths, like in the same way that we as individuals have dreams, that myths are the collective dream, if you will, of all humanity, that we all have dreamt this. Uh, Other great authors, one of my favorites is Sir James George Frazer in his book, The Golden Bough. Love this book, where he too begins to notice that all the stories that we tell are the exact same story. As Jung began to understand, we only tell one story. Now, one of the interesting things is that this one story that we tell is so obvious after a bit that people began to try to map it out, see if they can figure out how they can find a way to map that. And one of Jung's last proteges before he died was a man by the name of Joseph Campbell. Now, Joseph Campbell, uh, who's also very enamored with myths, also argued that all the myths that we tell are essentially the same story. And he wrote a book in 1948 called A Hero with a Thousand Faces. And this book, it's a pretty dense book, actually goes through and in detail maps out the one story that we tell. All of our great mythic stories can be mapped in this way. It's the exact same story, and it doesn't matter whether it's Star Wars or Harry Potter or Cinderella or pick any romantic comedy. It doesn't matter whether it's any Disney cartoon. All of the great stories, the great mythic stories that we tell are the same story. So he actually mapped it out. First this comes, then this comes, and this comes. And I've actually given you his map in your syllabus. If you actually go to your syllabus is located there in Moodle. And of course, the front page looks like this. And if you scroll down, there's a table of contents. And you work your way down here. You'll come down to, of course, the place that talks a little bit about my expectations. It tells about our schedule. And if you keep working your way down here, you'll also hear about our first essay that we're going to be writing, which will be due at the end of next week. But if you finally get down here, you will discover that we get to this place, working my way down here, still down here, where we have this document called the Monomyth. And I'm asking you to read this as your assignment after watching this. And here is, in detail, the hero's journey or the monomyth that Joseph Campbell, maps out. Because he talks about that there is this summon to adventure. And then, of course, the hero at first doesn't want to go on the call. But then there's a supernatural aid that will show up. And you can follow it right here all the way down. And I've even given you a map here where you could, if you're wanting to write your own novel, for example, or your own play or your own screenplay, you could actually use this as a paint-by-number way to write your story. If any of you were to go to get your master's in fine arts in writing, whether it's for novel writing or screenplay writing or dramatic play writing, they're going to teach you this one story because it's the only story we love. And if we only like one story, then we may as well just learn the one story, right? Now, Joseph Campbell did not believe in God or anything like that. Neither did Carl Jung. And toward the end of his life, in an interview, he wrote this. He says, "We find ourselves in every culture, in every era, from Gilgamesh to Star Wars, telling the same story over and over again. The question I am asked most often is, why? My simple but unsatisfying answer is just because." That seems like such a cop-out answer. I do not like that. Just because, that's like my mom. She would say, just do it because. Now, here is a very, very crude oversimplification of how it works. And it would start up here at the top and go counterclockwise, where you would have a call to adventure. And then once there's a call to adventure, the hero will inevitably pick up a helper. Now, this helper will often be some sort of a magical or supernatural helper in a lot of our folk stories or fairy stories. In the original Star Wars, you'll have a Luke Skywalker. His call to adventure is that his uncle and aunt get killed. But he picks up a supernatural helper, if you will, a magical helper in Obi-Wan Kenobi. You have Frodo in Lord of the Rings, who's going to have a call to adventure, and that is that there are these black riders coming after him to kill him because he's got a ring, but he's picked up a supernatural helper in Gandalf. And then there will be a series of tests that the hero must go through. Along with those tests, the hero will usually pick up some more helpers. Um, so Star Wars, he's going to pick up Chewbacca and Han Solo and Princess Leia. He's going to Frodo's going to pick up Merry and Pippin, and of course his very loyal friend Sam. Harry Potter's going to pick up some friends. In every fairy tale, they're going to pick up some friends that will kind of help them through the series of tests. And then Joseph Campbell noticed that the worst of the tests will be this one called the belly of the whale. There will be this point in the story where all seems lost. Now, George Lucas, when he wrote Star Wars, actually had Joseph Campbell's map in front of him. And so he just wrote the story paint by number. And his whale's belly moment is the trash compactor, where they seem like all is lost and they're about to die in the trash compactor. There always is that moment. In the romantic comedy, there's always that point where the heroine and the very hunky guy somehow have broken up. It seems like all is lost, and she's staring out the window in the rain. And oh, how are they ever going to get back together again? But of course, inevitably, they always do manage to get out of the belly of the whale. Now, sometimes Campbell would call it the pit of despair. And the author of the book and later the film, The Princess Bride, also used Campbell's map for his story. And the pit of despair, he just calls the pit of despair, which I think is kind of funny. And then there will be some additional tests, but the final test in the story will always require that the hero face that test alone. There'll be that point where Simba, despite the fact that he's picked up some friends, will have to face his Uncle Scar alone. There'll be a point where even Frodo will have to alone carry the ring to Mount Doom. There'll be a point where they all must fight the final test alone. Now, if the hero is going to die, it's going to be after that final test. But inevitably, the hero will bring back to the community that he or she started from a kind of boon, a kind of gift, if you will, so that the community will be better off for what the hero has done, even if the community doesn't realize what has taken place here. So this is it. If it seems like, well, yes, that doesn't seem anything magical. That seems like all of our stories are like that. There's nothing magical in that. But it took some people a while to realize, you know what? We like one story and one story only. And so our storytellers today, knowing that, if you read any sort of young adult novel, if you go to any Marvel film or DC film, you'll notice it's the exact same story because we only like this one story. And Jung would say it was the collective dream of humankind. But somebody who really subscribed to this, two people actually that subscribed to this idea of one story, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. And both of them really believed that there is just one story that we love. They loved fairy stories, fairy tales, they loved folk stories. And when they wrote their stories, they as well used this one great story. And instead of calling it the monomyth or the hero's journey, they called it the great story. I kind of like that name for it in some ways. And this is a quote from C.S. Lewis, because he's really actually going to give a better answer than Joseph Campbell later did about why. Why do we love one story? Why do we love one mythic story and just keep telling it over and over again? And he says, the value of the myths or the great stories we most enjoy is they reveal all the things we know about ourselves and restore those things which have been hidden by a veil of the familiar. Okay, that's a fancy way of saying the value of these mythic stories is that we've recognized something. There's something in it that seems familiar. And Lewis would say, of course there is something that seems familiar. It's because this is the story we are in. And then Lewis is going to take it a step further. He's going to say that that not only do we just tell one story, but the one story we tell has one point. Every one of our great stories has one point, and that is that you are more than you think you are. If you think about that, isn't that the point of all of our great stories? Isn't that the point of all of our great animated features? We have a character that discovers often that there's more to him or her than even he or she realized, that even maybe the parents realized, more than anyone in the community realized. And they're going to surprise everybody, sometimes even themselves. And Lewis would argue that the reason why that seems to resonate with us is because that's our story, because there is more to us than we realize. There is more to us than we realize. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen The Lion King, the original Lion King. I love it. It's one of my favorite Disney animated features. And if it has a kind of mythic appeal, it's because the author, same author who wrote the screenplay, who also wrote Little Mermaid and contributed to Beauty and the Beast, also the live-action Alice in Wonderland and some others, is very familiar with Campbell's hero's journey, or the Monomyth. So wrote kind of a paint by numbers script. If you think about it, you have Simba. He's going to have a call to adventure. He's going to have this terrible point where he's going to cross the threshold, which means there's a point of no return. He's going to pick up some buddies. It might be a pig and a meerkat, but they're buddies. And then there's a point where he'll have to fight the final test alone. He'll have to fight his Uncle Scar alone. But does anyone remember, there's this strange mythic moment in Lion King when, of course, Simba gets bonked on the head by a baboon, and he looks up in the sky, and it's as if his dead father, Mufasa, appears in the sky. Does anyone remember what he says in that wonderful James Earl Jones voice, which I love that voice. I wish I had a great voice. It's kind of the voice I imagine God having, well done, thou good and faithful servant. Well, maybe not that. But does anyone remember what Mufasa says to Simba? Because he says, remember who you are. You are more than you have become. That resonates. I remember seeing that in the theater when it first came out. It resonated with the entire theater because that is the mythic moment that Lewis is talking about. Not only are all of our great mythic stories, and I would call Lion King one of our mythic stories, not only are they telling the same story, they have the same point. Absolutely. Czeslaw Milosz, the great Nobel Prize-winning poet, says we tell one story and only one because there is a sense that we are more than we are. And then Robert Graves, also a poet, kind of an odd poet, says there are a million stories, but one myth. We are more than the dim creatures we seem to be. This is the essence of religion, as well as all literature. Every hero's story is our own. So why? Why is it? Why is it every story seems essentially the same story? Why is every heroic story especially the same story? And even our biblical hero stories, the stories of Samson and Gideon and Joshua and David, Joseph, they're all essentially the same story. It's because this is the story that resonates with us. John Eldridge, kind of echoing C.S. Lewis, says, we keep telling the same story because that's the story we're in. But notice something else here that I'd like to say, and that is, first of all, that's also the point of the this great story. I am a Seventh-day Adventist, and one of the neat things about Seventh-day Adventists is the plan of salvation with Seventh-day Adventists is a story. It's a big epic story. We call it the Great Controversy. And isn't the point of the Great Controversy, in many ways, that each one of us is more than we realize? I think that's the beautiful thing. I think that's the beautiful thing. Also, I don't know if anyone in the class is LDS, because I think that's the beautiful part about the LDS theology, which is that there's more to you than you realize. I think that's the beautiful thing of all Christianity, that there's more to you than you realize. However, I don't know if you noticed, I'm going to jump ahead here, that sometimes our story can kind of stink a little bit. And that's because all of our great mythic stories have a villain in it, or has a villain in it. Here's some of my favorite villains. I think that's because our story has a villain in it. The true great story, as C.S. Lewis would say, has a villain in it. There's Darth Vader or the Wicked Witch or the White Queen. I tell you what, the scariest one for me is the kid catcher in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. I don't know if anybody can relate to what I'm talking about here. So what I'm getting at here is that when we read these great stories, we're tapping into the thing that Carl Jung called the dream of humanity, that this is something that resonates with us all, which is why when you go see a film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you begin to realize, there's nothing new here. We're just telling the exact same story. If you go see a Star Wars chapter, I don't know what we're on now, you're just seeing the same story. If you go see a wonderful romantic comedy, and I will admit I love romantic comedies, it's the same story because it's the story we love. Now, I have an assignment here that I would like you to do, and I've attached it here just for you to respond, thinking about the story that you love. First of all, I'm going to ask you to talk about some of the stories that you truly love, the films you love, the books you love, the Bible stories you love. Then I want you to ask yourself, and I want you to be serious, and don't just flippantly say, I can't see anything in common. Ask yourself, what do they have in common? And what does this say about me? Because I think not only do we tell the same story over and over again, but the characters that resonate with us often say more about us individually. So if you are a Lord of the Rings fan, you might find that Frodo captures your imagination, or Aragorn the King, or Frodo the Hobbit. One of those characters would probably resonate with you. Which character is it that resonates with you in the stories that you love? And why? And what does it say about you? And I want you to actually write it down and post it, and so that we can kind of look at that. This will give me a chance to get to know you, because that's really my goal here. I don't get a chance to get to know you in the same way I would in a traditional class, but this is my way of getting to know you a little bit. So I want you to do that. I'm asking that you end the session here, and that you'll do that. And we just have a couple more here things that we're going to do for this week. But I think you're getting the hang of things already. And feel free to email me if you have any questions. I encourage you to go into the syllabus to notice that you do have a paper that will be due at the end of next week. So you might start thinking about that. What are you going to write about? Maybe it might be something about the monomyth and the great story that you're in. The other thing I would like to say, if I'm allowed, just a moment to get a little preachy, and that is, I believe the reason why the one story resonates with us is it truly is the story we're in. The great story, the great controversy, the epic story of good versus evil. And it's a story that we're not the main characters of. but we're certainly a significant part because God Himself has risked all for us. That is an amazing story. You know what that says about us? It says that we matter. Our great stories all tell us the same thing, that there is good and there is bad in the world, and we matter. So I hope you're going to get that point from our great stories. Anyway, I look forward to seeing some of the things you write. And then I look forward to seeing you again at our next lesson. So thank you so much.